Hello everyone, this is Josh Osowski for PPM 300. This is week 2. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the lectures, but before I do, I want to talk a little bit about the project and just remind you that as you're reading the articles, doing the discussions and so on, to keep thinking about what you want to do for your final project. If you do already have some ideas and some general direction where you think you're going to go, please email me. And I'd be interested in looking at it, and I'll be happy to give you some feedback. Next, I want to just give a little bit of feedback on how to read academic journal articles. When you first look at them, they can be a little bit intimidating, and that's normal. But you need to eventually get over that so you can really understand what's in them, because there's some good insight in these articles. So what I typically do when I look at a journal article is I'll begin by reading the abstract. Here the author will pretty much give you a synopsis of the entire article. Then I'll usually jump to the end of the article and read the discussion or the conclusion. And again, this will give me a real idea of what they're doing and what the purpose of this whole paper is. After that, I'll go back to the introduction and read the introduction. And here the author is going to talk about the other articles and literature that's out there that talks about this particular topic. Here often you get a lot of good insight on what is kind of the common thoughts, what are some of the counter thoughts to what they're going to say, and it really puts everything in perspective. The next section where they start outlining how they did their research and the statistical analysis, describing that. Sometimes you can kind of skim through that part, probably not going to be as important, especially for this class. Later on, if you do continue with additional studies, it may become more important. But I think for the purposes of this class, you can just kind of skim through that part. But the results I would pay a little more attention to. Often they'll kind of highlight some things that they don't talk about in the discussion and the conclusion. And then, of course, then you're back to the discussion and conclusion, and you may want to reread it again to really kind of cement it in. So that helps me. And so now I want to go into the readings for this week. And the first one is the psychological barriers to performance management, or why isn't everyone jumping on the bandwagon by Bain. This is a good article. I think it really kind of highlights kind of the overall kind of arguments and thoughts about the difficulties of performance management. And Bain starts by saying that if you ask people, every single person is in favor of government performing better. In fact, probably nobody would say they're against it. Yet people, managers, ourselves, we really aren't jumping on the bandwagon and really actively pursuing performance management. So his question is why? And he gives a couple of reasons why that's the case. He gives practical reasons, political, managerial, and psychological. With the practical reasons why people say they don't do it, people often say it's not proven, and they think that the costs outweigh the benefits. Political, he argues that politicians don't really win elections based on how well administrators perform. So it doesn't really become an important aspect there either. Managers, administrators like ourselves, will say that it's just too much work, it's too hard, my plate's already too full, I just can't do it. And lastly, and this is where the emphasis of the rest of the article is going to be on, are the psychological factors. Why, as people, don't we resist performance management? And the first reason he says why we have psychological barriers to performance management is that we're afraid that we'll be punished if we perform poorly. And he says that he's not going to spend a lot of time on that in this article because there's a lot of other supporting literature to state this. But it makes sense. If you think about it, I know every time they ask me for results, that's one of the first things that pops in my head. Uh-oh. If I don't do well, I'm going to get in trouble. But what he thinks that's probably more important and isn't researched well is because psychologically it requires people to think differently. In fact, it requires a complete mental reorientation. And this is the aspect that he's then going to focus on. So, looking at this complete mental reorientation, he states that government needs to shift from a traditional rules-driven management system to an innovative, results-driven management system. And if you think about that, there's some real importances there. in government, we are really rule driven. You know, we have to check the guidebooks, the policies, to see if we can or cannot do things. He says that this impedes performance. But if we are going to have this great complete mental reorientation, everyone's thinking is going to need to change, not just us, but everyone. So then he goes into the various groups of people who are going to have to change. For instance, he starts with citizens. Citizens' thinking is going to need to change. And the part that he thinks that's important here is that citizens need to start looking at, instead of it just being what's best for me, what's best for society. So that shift needs to take place. And I think that's a big one. Second, legislators need to think. The people who write our policies or laws need to change the way that they think about things. And the big problem he states here is they need to get away from this, well, I only have a few years for this term, see what I can get done. And typically everything becomes very short-sighted. So there's no long-term incentive. And he's going to talk later on about some ways to perhaps fix that. He also believes that public employees need to change the way that they think about performance. And they need to be more concerned with taking risk and doing something good rather than just following the rules and not making mistakes. So really going from a fear-driven way to manage to, all right, we're going to take some risk and we're going to do something good. Also, he sees that policymakers have this fallacy thinking that if they could just write a better policy, then performance is going to start happening in government. He disagrees with this. He doesn't think that we need more acts, more laws that demand that managers perform better. He's going to really narrow it down to saying that we need to really give managers more control, more aspect. That this is really a managerial problem, not a policy issue. The next thing is he talks about assistant secretaries thinking. And this is closely related to legislators in the fact that they have very short terms. In fact, the average assistant secretary in the federal government, their term is only a little over 2 years. So if you think about it, what can you really get done in 2 years? You probably spend the first year just trying to understand the organization, the people, the players, and then the second year maybe you can start getting some things done and then you're done. So again, the short-sightedness is really impeding performance. Next, distrustful thinking. Occasionally we get administrators or legislators that say to us, all right, we want the managers to bend the rules, to get around all the red tape so that they can perform better. However, in reality, the managers who then have to do this say, well, you know, I don't see any proof that if I do make a mistake or I break a rule, then I'm not going to be punished. So even though maybe managers at times will hear that they're going to let this slide if they make mistakes, as long as it's for the right purpose, they don't really believe it. So this distrustful thinking needs to be looked at. And lastly, he talks about big picture thinking. We have this idea, and especially if we think about politicians, they love to get in front of a camera and say that they're going to fix all the problems and government needs to be completely changed and all these super big picture things. However, in reality, almost nothing really changes that way. Slow, incremental changes are going to have a bigger impact in the long run than trying to make sweeping statements and sweeping changes in the short run. So he thinks we need to really focus on small solutions, steady over time, to make these changes. The problem, though, is politicians aren't going to be readily quick to jump on these kind of things. They're not sexy from a media point of view. They're not going to get headlines saying that we're going to make small changes and slowly make government better. So this is, again, is one of these barriers, thinkings that needs to change. So he next goes on to say that with all these different types of thinking, there basically can be boiled down into two types of thinking. Self-interested thinking, what's in it for me, and the second one is societal thinking, what's in it for the good of society. So for things like legislators who are more worried about winning the next election as opposed to doing something good for society would be a perfect example of the problems between self-interested thinking and thinking about societal concerns in general. So next he says the main problem is self-interested thinking. So how do we change this? And this really ends up being the crux of this article. And his solutions that he proposes are: one, we need to increase the term limits to get people thinking more long-term. Second, we need to show the promise of flexibility is real. So where we talked about distrustful thinking and managers being afraid of bending a few rules in order to perform better, we really need to change the rules so that that can actually happen, and managers know that they can be innovative and make bigger changes. And then third, the necessity of performance leadership. He uses the term leadership to really talk about managers who are actively and proactively managing to better productive changes. And he states that too often policy is used to force change, but it doesn't work. You need active performance leadership. An example he uses is Comstat in New York. There, managers are forced. The police department, of course, uses Comstat to look at crimes in precincts, and then the managers all get together each week to look at these statistics. And why this works here is that it's active leadership. So, for instance, some people might try to act like they're making a difference in New York with Comstat, but if they don't see real performance, real active changes in a short amount of time, what has happened with this more active performance leadership is that those managers are then let go. So it forces people to actually look at the problems and then actively come up with solutions to fix them. So his proposal boils down to being performance oriented, being active, and doing it in a leadership style. In the next article, entitled Performance Measurements, Accountability, and Improving Performance by Halichmi really delves into the meanings and the outcomes of two important terms that we often use in performance management. The two terms are accountability and performance. Now, with accountability, we're talking about things like transparency, and the fact that we as administrators, we're accountable to people, a variety of people. In fact, we are accountable to the legislators who write the laws and the policies. We are responsible to the managers, people who might be our own bosses, but also people in the executive branch, just like governors or mayors. But we're also ultimately responsible to the public. If we believe in democracy and the fact that the people choose their governance and decide what is best for them, ultimately we're accountable to the people. So this is one of the key aspects of government, is being accountable for all those purposes. But that's one thing, being accountable. The second major term that we use in performance management deals with, of course, with performance. And when we think about things like performance, we're of course talking about things like productivity and getting the most with limited resources. We talked quite a bit about this last week in some of the articles. But Halichmi goes on to state that when we're talking about performance management, we often use these terms sort of together. When we talk about better government, we say we want government to be more accountable. We want government to be more productive, to perform better. But the problem is that if we really analyze the difference between those two statements, accountability and performance, in many ways they're opposing forces. And so as an administrator, how can you do both left and right? How can you do both black and white? They're almost opposites, and makes it very, very difficult. So he basically says that as managers, maybe we don't have that. Maybe accountability is just too high of a cost. Maybe performance, if that's ultimately what we want, needs to play the most important role, and accountability needs to take a side seat. Now, if we take a look at the article on page 349, there's a really nice table that basically highlights the differences between accountability measures and performance measures. And a couple of them that I think are really insightful is if we look at the differences between them. and we look at the column where it says orientation purposes. Accountability has a perspective looking back. It's a historical perspective. Whereas performance measurement, you're looking towards the future. So just looking at that aspect alone, if our goal is looking backwards or our goal is looking forward, you could see where there's conflicts. In addition, activities involved with the two of them. Accountability measures are comparing to actual plans, or it's looking at the real numbers. Whereas with performance measurement, what's more important is experimentation and innovation. And again, you can see how those two things are very different. Accountability means you're expected to do this thing, so you better do it. But for performance, we're looking for, okay, what kind of new idea do you have? What's the new innovation? What are you going to experiment with? You can't really do both. You've got to do one or the other. If we look at who grades which measurement, accountants and auditors and lawyers and judges tend to be more concerned with accountability measurements, whereas the people who receive the service, who are providers of the service, public administrators, and even often elected officials, they're more interested in the performance. So again, here's the conflict. You have legislators and judges determining aspects of laws, and their focus is on accountability, doing exactly what the law says, and meanwhile, the people and the executive branch and the elected officials want performance measurement. They want innovation. They want new things. And then lastly, I think the ideal really hits it perfectly. Accountability measurements focus on thinking inside the box and staying within the contract, whereas performance measurements, you should be thinking outside the box, breaking away. So again, two very conflicting points of view. So I think the big takeaway from this article, and really questions that you need to ask yourself are, do you agree with this analysis? Can you measure for accountability without sacrificing performance? Is the cost of accountability worth the decrease in production, in performance? And how effective do we expect government really to be? And I think that's a good question. If we have these two extremes, you can't be totally effective and you can't be totally accountable. So what is that right mix? And I think as we are thinking about performance measures, in not only in this class but in our fields, we have to really take these two things into consideration. Accountability is absolutely important for democracy, but so is performance. And how do you really find that balance? In the final article entitled Productivity Barriers in the Public Sector by Ammons, we find a very straightforward article. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it because I think it is so straightforward. But basically, Ammons describes the variety of productivity barriers that as public administrators we might see. And he basically takes all of these barriers and lumps them into three different types of categories. The first are environmental barriers. And what these are barriers that are happening outside of the organization that managers might have to face. The second are organizational barriers, or barriers that occur within the organization, often based because of the rules and regulations that an organization may have. And then we have third that are personal barriers, or barriers that we as people, we may have certain strengths and weaknesses, and every person is a different type of manager. So as individuals, we bring our own personal barriers to the organization. But I think, like I said, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about this particular article. I do think it's an important one, and will help you as you're working on your project to come up with some of the barriers that you are going to encounter, and have the right terminology and the right way to describe them for your project. Lastly, I'd like to sum up some of the big findings from these three articles. And of course, they all fit into this common theme, which is the topic for this week, which is overcoming productivity barriers. And we see some common themes running through them. The first is government's short-sightedness. We talked about with Bain how elected officials and assistant secretaries, they serve short terms, and as a result their goals tend to be short-sighted. And what this ultimately does is each time you get a new person in power, they come up with new ideas. So you stop doing the performance that you were doing, you start these new things. And I really think that this constant starting and stopping is really impeding government and keeping it from performing and reaching more potential. The second thing that's also the big problem in these articles is, though we all know we want better government, we don't really know how to define what better government is. And in often cases, we don't even know ourselves what's going to make it better. Both Bain and Halichmi talk about this. Bain, when he's talking about his complete mental reorientation, is looking at how we all need to totally reorientate the way we think about government, that we really are so self-serving and not really looking at society as a whole. We need to change that. And Halichmi adds to that by saying that we really don't know how to define the problem. You know, we want better government, but we want better accountability and we want better performance. And Halichmi does a good job of showing how both of those goals are kind of hurting each other. They don't really work together. So we need to really pick in each situation, what do we want? Do we want more accountability or do we want more performance? And finally, the big thing I think that runs through these articles is this concept of fear. Administrators are so afraid to try anything beyond the rules and regulations, many of which of these rules and regulations are relics of the past or were there to safeguard an issue that maybe isn't even around anymore. But the risk of failing are so great that looking towards the future and new possibilities is almost impossible to do. But this is our task. And this is what we need to do if we're going to move government forward and really increase performance. So as you're thinking about your project, as you're thinking about this class, as you're thinking about working in general, this is your challenge as a manager. You know, how are you going to think outside the box? How are you going to work within the system but be able to transform it? So I challenge you all to continually be thinking about that, and I will see you next week.